40,000 soldiers, guns loaded, trenches dug. They waited for the Americans to attack. But the Americans never came. Instead, they did something far worse. They made the sky go dark. 7 days. That's all it took. 7 days to seal the fate of an entire army. 20 months later, only 17,000 walked out of that jungle. Marines said they looked like ghosts. What happened in those 7 days? And why did 87% of these men die without ever firing a shot? Subscribe to History of World War II and hit the bell. You won't want to miss this. Welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most ruthless victories in Pacific history. A victory won not with bullets, but with silence. To understand what happened on Bougainville, you first need to understand what Japan was protecting. Picture the Southwest Pacific in 1943. Japan controls a massive network of islands stretching from Southeast Asia to the Solomon Islands. At the heart of this network sits Rabaul, a fortress so powerful that American commanders called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Rabaul wasn't just a base. It was the beating heart of Japanese operations in the entire region. Over 100,000 troops, massive airfields, deep-water harbors capable of housing the entire combined fleet. Every supply convoy, every bombing mission, every troop movement in the Southwest Pacific flowed through Rabaul. And sitting just north of Bougainville was Buka Island, home to Japan's forward airfields. Think of Buka as Rabaul's eyes and ears. Those airfields could spot American movements hundreds of miles away. They could scramble fighters to intercept bombers. They could protect supply convoys sailing south to reinforce island garrisons. If Buka went blind, Rabaul would slowly suffocate, and everything below it would die. This wasn't just theory. Japanese commanders knew exactly how important those airfields were. They had invested millions of yen and thousands of man-hours building runways, maintenance facilities, fuel storage, and anti-aircraft positions. Buka was supposed to be impregnable. That's where Bougainville comes in. Bougainville itself was a nightmare. Over 3,000 square miles of dense jungle, jagged mountains, swamps that could swallow a man whole, and rainfall that never seemed to stop. The soil was too poor for farming. The terrain was nearly impossible to traverse. It was, by any measure, one of the worst places on Earth to station an army. But Japan didn't care about the terrain. They cared about what the island protected. General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded nearly 40,000 battle-hardened soldiers on Bougainville. Many had fought in China and Southeast Asia. They knew jungle warfare. They had spent months building an elaborate network of bunkers, tunnel systems, and artillery positions designed to repel any American invasion. Hyakutake was confident. His men were experienced. His defenses were strong. He expected the Americans to land, push inland, and fight a grinding campaign across ridges and through valleys for months on end. He was preparing for a battle that would never come. The irony is devastating. Every fortification his men built, every tunnel they dug, every artillery position they reinforced, none of it would matter. The Americans weren't interested in fighting for ridgelines. They were interested in something Hyakutake couldn't protect with bullets. His troops were world-class jungle fighters. His defenses were expertly designed. His tactical preparations were textbook perfect. And all of it was completely irrelevant to what was about to happen. But here's the question. If the Americans weren't going to fight for the whole island, what were they actually after? The answer was deceptively simple and absolutely devastating. By mid-1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur had developed a strategy that would change the entire Pacific War. They called it island hopping, and it was designed around one brutal principle. You don't have to kill an enemy to defeat them. You just have to cut off what keeps them alive. Traditional military doctrine said you had to capture every enemy stronghold, destroy every garrison, fight for every inch of ground. But Nimitz and MacArthur looked at the map and saw something different. They saw arteries. Every Japanese garrison, no matter how well fortified, depended on supply lines. Food, ammunition, medicine, fuel, reinforcements. Cut those lines, and the strongest fortress becomes a prison. The most elite soldiers become starving men waiting to die. Bougainville wasn't a target because of its strategic value. It was a target because of its geography. Specifically, one small stretch of coastline called Cape Torokina. Cape Torokina had almost no military significance. It wasn't near any major Japanese positions. It wasn't close to Rabaul. It had no port facilities, no existing infrastructure, nothing that traditional military planners would consider valuable. But it had one thing that mattered more than all of that combined. It was flat. Flat enough to build airfields. Airfields that could launch fighters and bombers directly at Buka. Airfields that could eventually threaten Rabaul itself. The Americans didn't need to conquer Bougainville. They just needed a patch of ground big enough to build runways. Everything else, the 40,000 Japanese troops, the elaborate defenses, the months of preparation, none of it would matter once those runways were operational. General Hyakutake was preparing for invasion. The Americans were preparing for construction. Think about the brilliance of this approach. Traditional military strategy would have required months of bloody combat, tens of thousands of casualties, and massive resource expenditure to take Bougainville by force. The Americans chose a different path entirely. They would let the Japanese keep their island. They would let them keep their guns, their bunkers, their elaborate defenses. All of that would become worthless once the skies belonged to America, and that difference would cost Japan an entire army. This is where the story takes a dark turn. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next is something military historians still study today. November 1st, 1943. Dawn, the sea off Cape Torokina, was quiet. Then the horizon erupted. American cruisers and destroyers opened fire, sending hundreds of shells crashing into the shoreline. The bombardment was overwhelming, designed not to destroy enemy positions, but to stun anyone in the area long enough for the landing craft to reach the beach. Waves of landing craft surged forward through smoke and salt spray, carrying 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division. They hit the beach expecting fierce resistance. What they found instead were barely 2,000 Japanese defenders. Most of them caught completely off guard by the speed and location of the assault. The heaviest fighting lasted only 3 days. By the time it was over, the Americans had secured a defensive perimeter roughly 15 kilometers across. American casualties, 78 killed, 200 wounded. Japanese casualties, nearly 500 dead, with the rest retreating into the jungle. From the Japanese perspective, this looked like the opening phase of a full-scale invasion. General Hyakutake immediately began mobilizing his 40,000 troops for counteroffensives. He sent units marching through the jungle to surround and destroy the American beachhead. But while Japanese soldiers hacked their way through dense vegetation, something far more important was happening behind American lines. Bulldozers. Behind the marine perimeter, construction crews worked around the clock. Engineers leveled ground, laid steel matting, and carved runways out of the jungle floor. The Marines weren't expanding territory. They were guarding construction zones. What looked like a beachhead was actually a launch pad, and within days it would be operational. The Japanese counterattacks that followed were fierce but futile. Hyakutake threw wave after wave of troops at the American perimeter. His men fought with extraordinary courage, charging through machine gun fire and artillery barrages. Hundreds died in frontal assaults that gained nothing. But even as his soldiers bled in the jungle, the real war was being decided elsewhere. Every hour that passed, the runways grew longer. Every day that passed, more aircraft arrived. Hyakutake was winning small tactical engagements while losing the strategic war completely. He was fighting yesterday's battle. The Americans were preparing for tomorrow's execution. This is where the fate of 40,000 men was sealed. From November 1st to November 11th, 1943, the skies above Buka Island became a killing field. The first aircraft to arrive were P-38 Lightnings, two-engine fighters that could outclimb and outgun anything Japan had in the region. They didn't attack ground targets. They waited. As soon as Japanese fighters attempted to take off from Buka's airfields, the P-38s descended on them. Most were shot down before they could even retract their landing gear. Those that made it airborne were often so badly damaged they crashed trying to return. Then came the bombers. B-25 Mitchells and B-24 Liberators arrived in waves, targeting fuel depots, repair facilities, and the runways themselves. They flew low enough to ensure accuracy, high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft fire. Within days, aviation fuel was burning across the island. Maintenance buildings were reduced to rubble. Runways were so cratered that even undamaged aircraft couldn't take off. The final blow came from SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Their attacks were surgical. They dropped bombs directly onto parked aircraft, ripping them apart piece by piece. Ground crews who had believed their positions were protected watched in horror as explosion after explosion tore through their airfield. Japanese pilots tried everything. They scrambled whatever fighters remained. They attempted night operations. They dragged surviving aircraft under tree cover, hoping to hide them from reconnaissance. It didn't matter. American reconnaissance planes spotted every movement. Repeat strikes destroyed hidden positions as quickly as they were established. By November 11th, Japanese air officers sent a desperate message to headquarters. We cannot rise to meet them. We are blind. In just 10 days, the Americans had destroyed over 100 aircraft. They had cratered every runway. They had burned every fuel depot. They had killed hundreds of trained pilots and mechanics who could never be replaced. Buka, which had served as the northern shield for all of Rabal's operations, was finished. No working aircraft, no fuel, no runway, no hope. The Japanese High Command in Rabal received the reports with growing horror. Without Buka's airfields, they couldn't protect supply convoys. Without protected convoys, they couldn't resupply Bougainville. Without resupply, 40,000 soldiers were trapped on an island that couldn't sustain them. The dominoes were falling. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The skies had gone dark. And for 40,000 men on Bougainville, the countdown to extinction had begun. They had no way of knowing that the war they were fighting was already over. Every bullet they saved, every position they held, every order they followed was now meaningless. The only question remaining was how long it would take for them to die. Think about it. Without air cover, how would supplies ever reach them? How would reinforcements arrive? The answer is, they wouldn't. Once Buka's airfields were destroyed, the ocean transformed from a supply route into a hunting ground. Japanese commanders still believed they had months of supplies remaining. They expected resupply convoys to arrive from Rabal, along with fresh troops to drive the Americans back into the sea. What they didn't understand was that without air cover, every ship that left Rabal became a target. American reconnaissance aircraft now had a clear view of the entire region. They could spot Japanese vessels while they were still hours away from Bougainville. Their reports guided destroyers positioned along shipping lanes. Submarines waited beneath the surface. Bombers patrolled from high altitude. It was a layered death trap. American commanders called it the Steel Ring. Ships that tried to run the blockade faced submarines that tracked them from below, destroyers that hunted them on the surface, and aircraft that attacked from above. There was no safe passage, no window of opportunity, no way through. If a transport escaped the submarines, destroyers intercepted it. If it survived the destroyers, bombers finished it off. Some ships never made it halfway. Others burned on the water, leaving trails of oil and debris stretching for miles. Within weeks, more than 10 Japanese supply ships were sunk. Hundreds of tons of food, medicine, ammunition, and fuel went to the bottom of the Pacific. Thousands of reinforcements meant for Bougainville drowned without ever seeing the island. The soldiers on the ground knew none of this. They only knew that the supplies they were expecting never arrived. The reinforcements they were promised never came. The rescue fleet they believed was on its way existed only in their hopes. General Hyakutake still believed a counterattack was possible. He organized offensive operations to break through the American perimeter at Cape Torokina. He ordered his men to prepare for jungle combat. But those counterattacks were doomed before they began. Not because of American firepower on the ground, but because of what had happened in those 7 days above Buka. The Americans had cut the artery. Now they just had to wait for the bleeding to stop. What makes this even more tragic is that the Japanese commanders on Bougainville had no idea how complete their isolation was. They received fragmentary reports about convoy losses. They heard rumors about difficulties at Rabaul, but they never understood the full picture. They believed they were temporarily cut off. They believed the situation would improve. They believed rescue was coming. That belief kept them fighting, kept them digging, kept them hoping. It also kept them dying. What happened next on Bougainville is one of the most horrifying slow-motion disasters in military history. Drop a comment. Did you know about this forgotten tragedy before today? By December 1943, the surface of Bougainville looked unchanged. Japanese troops still held their positions. Rifles were still loaded. Trenches were still manned. Officers still issued orders. But beneath that surface, the dying had already begun. No ships arrived. No aircraft circled overhead. The radios that once carried orders from Rabaul fell silent. Soldiers waited for the command to attack, for the announcement that reinforcements had landed, for any sign that Japan still remembered they existed. What came instead was nothing, and nothing on that island was lethal. General Hyakutake issued a final directive: hold your positions and live off the land. On paper, it sounded possible. In reality, Bougainville could not feed an army. 85% of the island was impenetrable rainforest. The soil was acidic and poor. Farming was impossible in most areas. There were no large animals to hunt, no grain to harvest, no way to sustain 40,000 men through conventional means. The mathematics of starvation are merciless. An active soldier needs approximately 3,000 calories per day to function. Soldiers on patrol, digging fortifications, or engaged in combat need even more. The jungle provided perhaps a few hundred calories per man if they were lucky. The deficit accumulated every single day. First, they cut rations. Full meals became half portions, then thirds. Rice was mixed with leaves and bark to stretch supplies. Men began eating things that had never been meant for human consumption. Then disease arrived. Beriberi struck first, caused by vitamin deficiency. Legs swelled, muscles weakened, nerves began to die. Men who had marched across China and Southeast Asia could no longer walk across a camp. Malaria swept through the positions, spreading through mosquito bites in the humid jungle air. Soldiers shook with fever, too weak to hold their weapons, too delirious to understand orders. Dysentery contaminated water sources, spreading through camps like wildfire. Men lost whatever nutrients they managed to consume, their bodies unable to hold on to anything. Wounds that should have healed in days festered into infections. Immune systems weakened by starvation couldn't fight off bacteria. Small cuts became gangrenous, blisters became ulcers. Men died from injuries that would have been minor inconveniences a few months earlier. Medical officers wrote reports documenting the collapse. One platoon recorded 50 active soldiers at the start of 1944. 6 months later, only 23 remained alive. And these weren't combat casualties. These were men who simply faded away. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Men who had believed in certain victory now faced certain death. Men who had written letters home promising to return now wrote farewell messages they had no way to send. Men who had dreamed of families and futures now dreamed only of food. Some tried to maintain morale through ritual and routine, morning exercises, evening roll calls, discussions of strategy for counterattacks that would never happen. It gave structure to days that otherwise offered nothing but waiting. But routine couldn't stop the hunger. Routine couldn't cure the diseases. Routine couldn't bring back the ships that would never come. As starvation deepened, desperation replaced discipline. Men who had once charged machine guns now spent their days hunting rats through the underbrush. Soldiers dug through mud for edible roots, stripped bark from trees for fiber, and roasted insects over small fires for any trace of protein. Some tried eating leather, cutting straps from their packs and boiling them for hours to soften the material. It didn't provide nutrition. It only delayed the hunger for a few hours. Escape attempts became increasingly desperate. A few soldiers tried swimming to nearby islands, using driftwood or empty fuel drums as flotation devices. Most drowned or were swept away by currents. Those who made it to shore often arrived too weak to survive. Others built crude rafts from bamboo and scraps of wood, pushing off under cover of darkness. Some were never seen again. A handful washed up on distant islands weeks later, delirious and dying from exposure. Night raids on American supply positions were attempted, but starving men cannot move silently. Their weakened bodies shook. Their feet dragged through the jungle floor, alerting patrols long before they reached their objectives. Most were killed or captured. The few who survived returned empty-handed, having burned more calories on the failed mission than any food could have replaced. Fishing parties worked shallow streams with nets woven from vines. Catches were pitiful. A few small fish divided among dozens of starving men. It was never enough. It was never going to be enough. The Japanese military code, Bushido, forbade surrender. Death was preferable to dishonor. For the men on Bougainville, that code became a prison within a prison. They couldn't surrender because their culture wouldn't allow it. They couldn't escape because the ocean was death. They couldn't fight because they had no strength left. All they could do was wait and die. By late 1944, the camps no longer resembled military positions. They resembled hospices. Men too weak to stand lay in rows, waiting for death or recovery that would never come. Officers who had once commanded hundreds now personally cared for the sick, having lost most of their subordinates. The jungle around them became a graveyard. Bodies were buried in shallow graves that the rain would often expose. Some units stopped burying their dead entirely, lacking the strength to dig. The living simply moved away from the deceased and continued their slow march toward the same fate. Letters found after the war tell fragments of this horror. Soldiers writing to wives they would never see again. Officers documenting their failures with clinical detachment. Young men barely out of their teens describing hunger so intense it dominated every thought, every dream, every waking moment. By early 1945, the war outside Bougainville was reaching its conclusion. American forces were island hopping toward Japan itself. The atomic bomb was months away from deployment. The end was visible to everyone except the forgotten soldiers in the jungle. Tokyo had already written them off. Japan's remaining resources were being concentrated for homeland defense. Bougainville wasn't just abandoned, it was erased from operational planning. The men there were considered strategically irrelevant, left to survive or die on their own. Most of them didn't know that. They still believed a relief fleet would appear on the horizon. They still carried rifles, even though those rifles weighed more than their wasted bodies could support. They still followed orders, even though the officers giving orders were dying alongside them. The death rate accelerated through the spring of 1945. Between 50 and 100 men died every 24 hours. Not from bullets, not from bombs, from hearts too weak to keep beating. From lungs too depleted to draw breath. from brains to starved of nutrients to stay conscious. Some men stopped speaking entirely, preserving what little energy they had left. Others stopped moving, lying in their shelters for days at a time. Many simply didn't wake up. Roll calls became shorter every week. Eventually, officers stopped calling names. There was no point. Of the 40,000 soldiers who had arrived on Bougainville, more than 23,000 died before the war's end. They died in silence, in the rain, under trees that would eventually swallow all traces of their existence. These weren't anonymous casualties on some distant battlefield. These were individual men with individual stories. Farmers from rural villages, fishermen from coastal towns, students who had been pulled from universities. Each one had a name, a family, hopes for after the war. Each one died believing that Japan still cared, that rescue was still possible, that their sacrifice still mattered. By the time they learned the truth, it was far too late for most of them. Can you imagine holding a position for 20 months, watching your comrades die one by one, still believing rescue was coming? August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through static on a radio somewhere in the jungle. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Many soldiers refused to believe it at first. They thought it was American propaganda, a trick to lure them from their positions. It took General Hyakutake, speaking through the last functioning radio units, to confirm the impossible truth. Japan had lost. Their war was finished. But for the men on Bougainville, it had been finished for nearly 2 years. Some men wept. Not because they had lost the war, but because they realized their brothers had died for nothing. All the suffering, all the starvation, all the desperate hope that rescue would come, none of it had mattered. On September 8, 1945, the survivors finally emerged from the jungle. They did not march out like soldiers. They drifted forward like apparitions. Uniforms hung from skeletal frames. Ribs pressed through paper-thin skin. Eyes stared without seeing. Out of 40,000 men, only 17,000 remained alive. American Marines who witnessed the surrender described it as something from a nightmare. One later recalled, "I thought they were prisoners from a death camp. I didn't realize they were soldiers." Many collapsed as they approached American lines. Some died the moment food or water touched their lips. Their organs, weakened by months of starvation, couldn't process sudden nutrition. Medical teams tried to save them, but refeeding syndrome killed dozens before anything could be done. Those who survived spent months recovering in hospitals. Some never fully recovered, carrying permanent damage to their digestive systems, their lungs, their immune systems for the rest of their lives. Most never spoke of Bougainville again. The survivors returned to a Japan that was itself starving, bombed, and defeated. They came home to families who had mourned them as dead. They came home to a country that didn't want to hear about failure, about starvation, about the slow extinction of an army that had been abandoned by its own command. So they stayed silent. They built new lives. They tried to forget the faces of friends who had died beside them, the sounds of men crying for water in the night, the feeling of hunger that never quite left their bodies. For decades, Bougainville remained one of the war's forgotten chapters, a footnote in larger histories, a statistic without human faces. Historians describe Bougainville not as a battle, but as a sentence. The Americans never needed to storm the island. They never needed to fight 40,000 entrenched soldiers through jungle and mountain. They just needed to remove the ability to resupply. Time, hunger, and disease did the rest. The real victory was won in those 7 days above Buka's airfields, when the last Japanese fighter fell from the sky, when the last runway was cratered beyond repair, when the last radio operator sent his desperate message, the fate of an entire army was sealed. They continued to dig trenches. They continued to follow orders. They continued to believe that rescue was coming, but their lifeline had already been cut. The war on Bougainville ended the moment the skies went dark. The dying just took longer. Today, the jungle has reclaimed almost everything. Trees stand where bunkers once sat. Rain falls where artillery used to echo. The only thing that remains is the silence. The same silence that began in November 1943, when 40,000 soldiers became prisoners of an island that would slowly consume them. Military academies still study Bougainville today, not as a battle, but as a masterclass in strategic thinking. How do you defeat an enemy without fighting them directly? How do you destroy an army without losing your own soldiers? The answers are written in the starvation records of 23,000 men. Island hopping wasn't just a military strategy. It was a calculated death sentence delivered from the sky. It was the understanding that modern warfare isn't just about killing the enemy. It's about removing their ability to survive. The Japanese soldiers on Bougainville were brave. They were disciplined. They were willing to die for their country. None of that mattered once the supply lines were cut. 40,000 men arrived as soldiers. 17,000 walked out as ghosts. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and the notification bell. History of World War II brings you the battles they don't teach in school, the decisions that changed everything, and the forgotten soldiers who deserve to be remembered. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. History never forgets those who truly deserve to be remembered.